So what I'm talking about this time is a little different, but I really love this show, so I thought I'd talk about it. The New Adventures of Lucky Luke, the French animated series based off of the comic book of the same name, created by Maurice and René Goscinny. If the latter name sounds familiar, it's probably because he was also the co-writer and sort of co-creator of the Asterix de Gaulle series. And while granted this series did continue to get made even after his death, much like Asterix was, it can't be denied that he was a big part in making this series popular. The comics got their start back in the 50s, like a lot of Franco-Belgian comics did, and it's much like Asterix de Gaulle, a comedy adventure series, but this one's a little bit more, I don't want to say serious, but gritty, maybe? I mean, it's nowhere near like Red Dead Redemption or True Grit or anything like that, but it does have a bit more of a sense of realism and just a little bit more of that kind of Wild West edge to it compared to Asterix de Gaulle, which was a lot more fanciful and a lot more goofy. The series follows the exploits of our title character, Lucky Luke, the slow-talking, chilled cowboy who can shoot faster than his own shadow, who goes around the Wild West as a poor, lonesome cowboy, fighting crime and just generally trying to keep the peace in the West. The comics do definitely follow that René Goscinny style in that while they are mostly just comedy exploits, they do definitely have an element of structure and an element of drama and actual suspense to them that makes them very engaging. Of course, this one doesn't have any magic potions or any kind of stuff like that. Most of the supernatural elements come from just how insanely accurate and fast Lucky Luke can shoot things. But beyond that, it is a lot of fun, and it's definitely something worth checking out if you like Asterix. But we're here to talk about the animated adaptation from 2002. Now, there were two previous animated TV adaptations before this, one in the 80s done by Hanna-Barbera and one in the 90s done by Molen Video, both of which were direct adaptations of the original comics. The New Adventures, on the other hand, are completely original stories made specifically for TV. And in my opinion, I think this is the best thing that the Lucky Luke franchise has ever given us. The comics are good, but they definitely have some of those old writing tropes that can make them a little bit difficult to read or follow if you're into more modern, exciting and action-packed stuff. This TV series definitely ups the tempo of the original comics and also has a much more modern and kind of cynical sense of writing about it, while still keeping true to the kind of fun and whimsical elements that the comics originally gave us. The show is more or less nothing different in terms of premise to the comic books, but of course, as I said, all the stories are completely original, so they tap into things that the comics hadn't yet tapped into yet, which is really cool. The comics often involve Lucky Luke taking on actual representations of Wild West figures such as Calamity Jane, Jesse James, and kind of the Dalton Gang. I mean, the Daltons in the comics are sort of based off of the real Dalton Gang, but not. It's a bit confusing to explain. And also has him partaking in famous historical events that relate to the Wild West, such as the wagon train, the invention of barbed wire, the invention of the first slot machines, and other such things. This TV series expands on that by having Luke take on other fictionalized versions of real-life historical figures such as Buffalo Bill and General Custer, who is basically this show's interpretation of George W. Bush, which is hilarious. And partaking in fictionalized versions of real historical events, such as the Alaska Purchase and the inventions of the first ever airplane. But, also like the comics, he also takes on fictionalized characters who do partake in fictionalized events, such as Poker Face, who invents the first ever Indian casino, which, of course, that didn't actually happen in the Old West. So it stays true to the comics in terms of its formula, and it definitely stays true to the comics in terms of its art style, because wow, this art style is pretty much like they took the exact style of the comics and translated it into a TV series. It looks amazing. The animation's definitely not anything that's that spectacular in terms of something that you would see nowadays, but for early 2000s it is definitely very impressive. It's very fluent, it's not too bouncy, but again it kind of sticks true to that whole comic book feel in that regard. And if you've read the comics, you'll know that there's parts where they use colour very sparingly and they only have certain things highlighted in very very strange and gaudy colours, but that's how the style of the comic is, and they do the same thing in the TV show, and it looks great. I also like the touch of how the backgrounds and the backdrops are done with very heavy inked and very detailed kind of ways, but the characters are done with much more basic line work, which again is very similar to what the comics look like, and they do actually match up surprisingly well. The voice acting is also excellent. Since most of them are specialised in dubbing French cartoons, I've not really heard of any of them, but they all do amazing jobs. Lucky Luke's got this very kind of deep, low Paul Newman kind of voice, which really works well for his character, and it definitely makes him very relatable, and even in spite of the fact that he very rarely shows any other emotion other than laid back, they do actually have him go through a different gambit of emotions than you normally would see him do, but it still feels like Lucky Luke, and it does give him a bit more personality and a bit more life to his character, which is very good. Jolly Jumper's voice, as in his horse, is also perfect. He's meant to be this very snooty, upper-class, cynical, smartass kind of character, and the voice they gave him is absolutely pitch perfect. He sounds a lot like Judge Whitey from Futurama, just a bit less condescending, and it's perfect. And the voices of the Daltons, the series' most popular characters and the most reoccurring villains, are also excellent. Joe's voice is very gruff and grumbly, and you can definitely sense the anger in his voice, which again fits perfectly. And Admiral sounds very dumb, but also very kind of unaware that he's stupid sort of voice, which again works perfect. And even Jack and William have a bit more of a personality to their voices, which is good because previously they didn't really have any personality, but it's good to see that they have a bit more identifiable elements to them this time around. The only issue that comes to it is because there's only a small handful of voice actors, a lot of them are reused over and over again, which is fine, but in the case of the guy who does the voice of Joe Dalton, he voices pretty much every single villain in the series. And while he is a really good voice actor, he can't really disguise his voice very well, so you can tell every time that it's him doing the voice. Again, he's a perfect voice to play the villains, but he just sounds like Joe with every voice he does, but it's not really a bad thing, it's just something you notice a lot. But the true merit of this show comes from its writing. The writing is excellent. It takes that very Franco-Belgian bande dessinée style of goofy writing that has a lot of intrigue and mystery mixed into it, and evolves it into the modern day with some more cynical and modern day writing tropes without making it feel like it's kind of crapping on the original or just trying to make it a more modern version. It's definitely a really good balance, and it makes the show very engaging, very funny, and they also have a lot more mystery-based stories this time around, which I really enjoy because I love those kinds of stories, and for the most part they work out really, really well. There's a lot of really good mysteries in this show. There are some episodes that aren't as good as others. For example, the one where the Daltons take care of a baby wasn't exactly the best episode, and the one where a bunch of directors come to the Wild West to shoot a movie, I wasn't quite as interested in those. But for the most part, all the episodes are a ton of fun, and I really recommend checking them out. There is one thing though that I should mention about this series that might make it a little bit awkward for some people. Now, if you're familiar with Franco-Belgian comics, particularly the comedy or adventure-based ones, you'll know that the way in which they portray ethnic minorities is not the most flattering. Now, to be fair, this comes down to the fact that the French sense of humour is very blue, and they're pretty much very vitriolic in depicting anybody who isn't French. That's just the way that they do it. But yeah, it can be pretty near the knuckle sometimes. If you've read Asterix or Tintin, then you can see that definitely in their portrayal of African characters or anybody who's meant to be black. In Lucky Luke, this comes down to their depiction of Asian characters who are very buck-teeth, squinty-eyed, have massive glasses, and in the case of the TV show, speak in that incredibly exaggerated Mickey Rooney-esque Asian accent. Though, I will give them credit, in the terms of this show, it's mostly the depiction of them in terms of their appearance and voice that is really awkward. In terms of their characters, while you could argue some of them are a little bit offensive in how they're shown to be so over-eager but not particularly bright is a bit offensive, for the most part their characters are mostly very well-rounded and they don't do anything that is too offensive. They are mostly considered to be quite intelligent or just very enthusiastic and do actually help out Lucky Luke on many occasions. But yeah, I can't deny that this probably would be a bit awkward for some people to watch, but just bear that in mind when you're watching this series. If you're very sensitive to racialist humour, there is quite a bit of it in this show, but it's not in every episode, so you can just skip over the ones that do have it. Beyond that though, I think this show is excellent and a really good way to introduce people to a franchise that outside of France is probably not as well known, and there definitely should be, because it's a really good franchise, and this show is probably the best thing that has ever come out of it. And its success has really upped the Lucky Luke franchise and the company that made this show, XLM, who you probably know as the creators of Oggy and the Cockroaches, into a really much better and prestigious kind of period for themselves. The Lucky Luke comics kept getting made even after the creator died anyway, but after this show it seems like they're being made more and more anyway. And it also gave us some more animated adaptations, including a movie called Go West, which is one of the best animated movies I've ever seen, as well as the Dalton spin-off series, which, while not as good as The New Adventures, is a very fun show and also has great animation, and the Rin Tin Can spin-off series, which it wasn't really that much impressive, but it is good to see Lucky Luke getting some more appreciation in the modern day. So far, Lucky Luke in terms of animated adaptations has been on a bit of a hiatus, but I'm sure we'll see something new in the future, and I'm really excited to see what we come up with in this franchise. But we'll see what I break on the Chain Gang next time.